Well, thank you so much for allowing me to present remotely here. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm following along all day today. I'm going to be presenting some research here about revisiting the effects of skills on economic inequality. I'm going to be looking both within and across countries using the PIAAC data. All right, so the paper is really motivated here by the observation that skill levels and economic distributions, correlations have been noted between them in both formal academic literature and also in popular discussion. That said, some of the previous literature that's out there from an academic perspective has found some mixed results in terms of kind of the magnitudes of any identified correlations and effects, for example. And in my reading of the literature, this is really due to variation in empirical methods, but it's also due to limited availability of consistent skill data that's separate from education. In the previous paper, Bob Lerman made the similar point that in the past people have used education and sometimes experience as proxies for skill. And so we really have an opportunity here to use the PIAAC data to actually try to do something a little more precise in terms of skill itself, and also to look at an international context here, given the number of countries involved, where there are differences, of course, in terms of economic factors of demand and supply, and also in terms of less tangible factors in terms of differences in institutions and customs and culture, for example. In terms of my research questions, I start by trying to think about the relative contributions to economic inequality, wage or earnings inequality here, for three different things. And so the first one is I want to think about contributions that have to do with levels of observable variables. So the things we see in PIAAC in terms of levels of skills and education and experience and anything else. I then want to separate that from the parts of economic inequality that are due to labor market rates of returns, so the effects of those levels that we see in number one, and then I'm going to separate those two from unobservable factors, unmodeled things, such as institutional differences that may be in play behind the scenes. So I want to think about whether the new data is going to confirm previous findings or not. And I'm also going to think about whether the new problem-solving skills are something that might be driving differences across previous results and the results I see here, or whether differences are due to a different time period, different data definitions, different scope of country coverage, etc. So just to give you a quick preview in terms of my findings, in a descriptive sense, there is, of course, evidence in PIAAC of substantial economic inequality, also inequality in terms of skill measures across countries, across genders, etc. In addition to that, I can see that in terms of skill measures, there's more variability in the lower half of each country's skill distribution, but there's more variability in the upper halves of country-specific wage distributions. And so we'll be trying to think about that pattern as well. In terms of the more formal modeling, I'm going to be using an econometric decomposition analysis to get at the three different components that I was just talking about. And I'm going to be finding, basically, that unobservable characteristics are a primary driver, much more so than the demand and supply factors that are being controlled for here via the observable characteristics. And the problem-solving measure is not substantially reducing the importance of unobservable factors, which has also been noted in the literature. In terms of gender, labor economics, for example, has split out gender as an important determinant of wages. And so I'm going to be thinking about that as well, doing some results separately by genders. The major result about unobservables, however, is unchanged across those two subpopulations. The data is from 23 OECD countries that are publicly available. So of course PIAAC was done on 24. Australia is the country for which the public use data is not available. Most of these countries, 22 of these countries are coming from the international national database, and then Cyprus was merged in from the German data catalog. That said, I'm starting with this aggregate data set, but because some of the countries don't have all of the data and and aren't perfectly comparable on some of the variables, there's further restrictions that we'll see as we go through. So lots of numbers here, but don't worry about them. What I basically want to point out is that we could think, of course, about means, the midpoints of distributions for skills, for example, but that's not going to tell us too much about inequality. And so the three measures that I'm really going to be focusing in on are standard deviation, which is going to tell us something about the spread of the distribution. And then I'm going to also look at percentile differentials. And for the percentile differentials, I'm going to be thinking about the difference between the median, the 50th percentile, and the 10th percentile. So 50 hyphen 10 is the 50-10 percentile differential. And then I'm also going to be thinking about the upper half of the skill distribution in terms of the difference between someone who's at the 90th percentile versus the median. So I'm going to think of those three things as getting at inequality here in terms of skills. And the one thing that I'll point out specifically in this table is that we have in terms of kind of the highest variability, at least at the upper end of the skill distributions, we see that for the English-speaking countries, for Canada, for the United States, and for the United Kingdom. And this is actually something that's been pointed out in some previous literature as well. And I want you to kind of hold that point because I'm going to come back to it and use it for something very specific in my model. If I want to look at the wage data, in contrast to the previous paper, I primarily focused on log hourly wages as opposed to monthly wages, but I do some sensitivity checks at the end. But these are 50-10 and 90-50 percentile differentials here. So giving us an indication of kind of what inequality looks like in an economic sense at the low end of the distribution for the poorer people versus for richer people, people who are at the higher end of the distribution with those darker bars here. And we see a lot of variability across country. We also see that there tends to be in a lot of countries more variability in the upper part of the distribution. We see that same pattern for men if we split this up as a subgroup here, but it's much more dramatic for women, where in the upper half of the wage distribution, we're really seeing a lot of differences between somebody at the 90th percentile versus the 50th percentile. Okay, sorry, I lost, getting hung up by the lag here. There is, of course, some previous literature that has looked at market returns, literacy, numeracy, and problem solving. There's a paper by Hanishek in 2013, and if I had known about the previous paper that was just presented, I would have added that here as well. But these studies are basically looking at returns to skill, and in terms of the Hanishek paper here, Hanishek and co-authors, they find statistically and economically significant relationships between skill and wage levels. Of course, I'm taking this in terms of looking at inequality. So while this literature is definitely very interrelated, this is kind of a next step in terms of looking at inequality across countries. There is some literature on inequality across countries specifically, and I'll just point out two papers here. DeVroy and Freeman, and then Blau and Kahn, they both used previous skill surveys, the International Adult Literacy Survey, for a number of countries. And they basically found fairly low correlations between skill inequality and earnings inequality. But they also found that unexplained portions of the models were really dominating skill levels as a major determinant. And so this is where I was entering with PIAAC to see if the new problem-solving measures, the greater extent of this survey in general, could explain more of the differences. I'm going to be using the econometric decomposition methods to get at the three factors I mentioned before. And don't get hung up with these equations, but for those of you who have seen kind of econometric equations, the very basic intuition here comes from a paper, June et al. In '93, where the authors start with a standard wage equation. So think of Y as your wage variable and X as your skill levels, your education, and so forth. They think about rewriting the error term in terms of its conditional conditional cumulative distribution, and then they rewrite in terms of a baseline country B relative to a country J. And so that's the framework I'm going to be thinking about here, is measuring inequality relative to a base country, and then splitting up components in equations 4, 5, and 6, which actually add up to what we see in number 3 here, for the observable factors, the observable returns, and the unobservable factors. In kind of the language of econometrics, the observable quantities is telling me something about what's the effect of the x, what's happening with the x's, versus the returns is telling me what's happening with the betas, and the unobserved factors is telling me what's happening in terms of the error term. For the baseline country, that point about the English-speaking countries being outliers in terms of skill inequality, that's coming into play here because I made the judgment call to try to use that as a base country to help with context of interpretation. The United States and Canada didn't have continuous wage distributions in the public use data, at least the one I had access to, and so I chose the UK as the baseline country in order to do the interpretations. There are lots and lots of tables like this in the actual paper, lots of versions for different subsamples and so forth. But the basic idea is in the first column here, the total difference between country J and the baseline. So the first number, for example, is between the Czech Republic and the base of the United Kingdom. What we're finding is that the Czech Republic has approximately 6%, because this was log wage, so we have this percentage interpretation here in an approximate sense, approximately 6% lower inequality in terms of the total difference here. Inequality is measured by the standard deviation of log wages, whereas a country like Estonia has about a 7% higher than the UK, a standard deviation of log wages. This is then being broken up into that observable quantities, the observable returns, and the unobservables using those equations from the previous slide. And the big picture is that the really dominant factor is still the unobservable component. The lower bound here is it's about 67%, for example, of the total difference. Same kind of thing for the 50-10 log wage differential. Unobservables are still very dominant. Same kind of thing for the 90-50 log wage differential. If we want to look at that upper half, the inequality of the richer groups, for example, we see the same pattern. Now, in those specifications that I just had up on the slide, I was just controlling for skills, the 3 different skill categories that we've been thinking about today. But I've also looked at including other non-skill determinants into the regression as observable factors as well. So I controlled for age in terms of categorical age ranges, education experience, and experience squared in order to get a nonlinearity in experience. And then what I find is actually very similar to the previous results. For the standard deviation of log earnings, 11 out of the 12 country pairs, we see a greater importance of unobservable factors than anything else. For the 50-10 log wage differential, for 9 out of 12 cases, we see that pattern. For 90-50, we see 8 out of 12 cases, we see that pattern. Also see a similar pattern by gender, also see a similar pattern by immigration status. Of course, the paper has details on all of these other robustness tests as well. I also looked at alternative education measures to include non-formal education, for example, excluding the age variables. I had primarily used the age variables because I was not making a restriction to prime age workers here. I was actually trying to use the larger sample size, and so I was controlling for age as a supplemental factor, but I excluded that. I also tried some different earnings measures, including the one used in the last paper, and didn't find any substantially different results. A big picture caveat was that complete analysis of all the countries in PIAAC was not possible here because of some data limitations. So while this data set definitely does have much better background information and is more developed than other skill surveys and so forth, there were still some limitations. There were some countries not reporting problem-solving skills. There were some countries not reporting continuous wage measures but reporting quintiles instead. There were some countries that didn't have things like gender, years of education. And so for different runs of this, I was able to use a different set of countries. So this definitely suggests that there would be use in the future to pay even more attention to having comprehensive comparable data for international studies such as this one. The big picture conclusion here was that unobservable factors were really key. What are the unobservable factors? This might include institutional attributes that aren't controlled for here. It might also include things like unobserved individual characteristics, such as non-cognitive skill, that perhaps is still not being picked up in the measures here. So definitely some things to be thinking about in terms of future work. Adding institutional factors directly might provide some value added here. I got the 5-minute warning. Thank you. Popping up on my screen. In addition to that, some of the literature that's out there that I reviewed identified some indicators that might pertain to some of these kind of institutional differences. And that type of a framework could definitely be merged with this one, I think, in the future. Some very preliminary examination that I did looking at some institutional factors such as union density and public sector employment, which were available from OECD across a number of the countries here. It looked like those were probably inversely related to earnings inequality, but I did not include them directly in the model. And so I really think of that as a potential next step that could be useful here. The paper suggests that there's limits in terms of education and training programs that are relating to increasing skills. There's limits in terms of reducing wage inequality at the same time. That doesn't mean that these programs don't increase skills, right? I think there's great evidence that programs do matter. But for this kind of secondary purpose of also reducing wage inequality, it looks like there might be some limitations. At least that's what I found here in terms of this paper. Of course, understanding the particular institutions and how they matter is complex and a great starting point for additional research after this. One disadvantage of the decomposition methodology is that it discounts supply and demand factors that affect wages, and so there's some different methodologies out there, including more structural modeling of the demand side and the supply side of the market, which might be used to compare and contrast what I've done here. There's also some recent literature suggesting quantile regression methods, so some different, more sophisticated regression methods might be built into this for comparison into the future as well. And then there's other ways to think about economic risk and other ways to think about inequality in general. I think it would be useful to examine race and ethnicity, perhaps within the context of the U.S., where those types of indicators are available, as opposed to in this international data set, or a more detailed examination of immigrants versus natives would be useful as well. And then as more PIAAC data releases come out, as in the future, for example, if this is done again for these same countries, we could definitely look at some changes over time, which I think would be useful as well.